A global conflict is underway. It's unfolding in several conflict zones as we speak and looks likely to spread. But it's not only playing out on battlefields, it's also an economic war and a war of ideas that's being waged in the hearts and minds of everyone connected to the internet. And what's at stake is the very world order itself. But how long will this conflict last? The legendary astrologer Andre Barau, who predicted the pandemic of 2020 many years before he died in 2019, thought that these years would see a great crisis. But he thought it would be resolved in 2026, when the world would see a splendid relaunch of civilization. But right now, it's hard to see how such a thing could come to pass in such a short period of time. Are we about to enter a glorious new age in 2026? Or are we about to live through a much longer crisis? In this video, the final episode of the New Age 2026 series, we're going to consider two scenarios for the future of the world over the coming decade. We're also going to see how what's at stake here is the distribution of global power and the system of world governance itself. What's really mind-blowing is how the establishment of some sort of world system was seemingly promised by the current 500-year synodic cycle of Pluto and Neptune, which began with conjunctions in the late 19th century. So strap yourself in for this series' final journey into the past to understand the present and the future. We live today in a deeply interconnected world, one with limited resources and big problems that have implications for every country and person on the planet. In other words, we live in, as Marshall McLuhan put it, a global village. And so it was surely inevitable that as the world shrank, the question of how this global village should be governed would come to the fore. Now, the global village is enabled by technologies that permit fast travel around the planet and instant communication, and they began to appear around the time of the last conjunctions of Pluto and Neptune in the late 19th century. This was the time when radio and a global communications network and the first heavier-than-air flying machines appeared. And, would you believe it, the theme of world government also came into view around that time. In 1883, a Scottish lawyer and academic named James Lorimer published a book called The Institutes of the Law of Nations, which established the idea of international organizations. And then in 1889, the first attempt at organizing a world parliament was made. It was called the Inter-Parliamentary Union, and the first meeting saw representatives of 9 countries meeting in France. The IPU still exists, and today it has 180 members. Now, when we see something happening during a conjunctional period, how can we tell that it's genuinely relevant to the cycle we're looking at? Well, one way is to make sure it fits the archetypal significations of the planets concerned. One of Pluto's core significations is power, and Neptune has to do with universalism and connectedness. Global governance fits within the archetypal complex described by these planets. But if we're looking at a cycle that's already completed or is still underway, we can also look to see if the theme in question came up again and again as the two planets concerned made aspects with each other. And when we do that with the theme of global governance in mind, we see some fascinating stuff. If you've enjoyed this series, or whether you're just tuning in for the first time now, please do click the like button if you like what we're doing. And remember, you can always subscribe to the channel if you want to make sure you don't miss out on future episodes. Thanks. As we've already seen in this series, between roughly 1914 and 1919, Pluto and Neptune were in orb of a semi-sextile aspect. This period saw the First World War and resulted in January 1920 in the establishment of the League of Nations, which was set up with the stated goal of maintaining world peace. In other words, we saw the establishment of an institution of global governance exactly as promised during the conjunctional period. But of course, the League of Nations failed in its mission, and the Second World War broke out in 1939. Now, let's turn back to the archetypal explorer chart we've been looking at, showing the Pluto and Neptune sextile coming into orb. We've seen many times how things that were promised by the conjunctions of the late 19th century came into being when Pluto and Neptune came into orb of sextile in the 1940s. We saw it with the nuclear bomb, we saw it with the UFO, and we saw it with the transistor. And guess what? We see it with global governance. Because what came after the conclusion of the Second World War in 1945, but the establishment of the United Nations, which of course remains extant to this day. And around the same time, the Bretton Woods Agreement was made, which essentially established the US dollar as the global reserve currency. Now, we also saw how this period of the long sextile between Pluto and Neptune coincided perfectly with the Cold War, when the world was mostly divided into two great camps and lived under the shadow of nuclear war. As the two planets separated, the Cold War ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and we entered a period dominated by a single superpower, the United States. That world order held quite steady for 30 years or so. But now, Pluto and Neptune are getting close once again to perfecting sextiles, which they're going to do every year from 2026 to 2032. And what we're seeing are challenges to the order that's held since the breakup of the Soviet Union. Those challenges are coming from the US's old adversary, Russia, as well as China and various other allied states. And by the way, that's not to suggest that only one side is on the offensive. It does take two to tango. But as we saw in this episode, talk of nuclear war is louder now than it has been since the Cold War ended. And so it seems to me that one of the big stories of the coming years is the struggle to come to a new settlement or a new system of global governance or distribution of power that will be accepted by all and bring peace one way or the other. And so the obvious question is, what will it take to get there? I'm not the kind of astrologer who will tell you exactly what's going to happen as if I know for sure, because I don't. That style is very engaging and effective on social media, but the reality is that probably nobody on this planet knows what's coming for sure. What I think we can do is sketch some possible scenarios so that we're ready for them if and when they come to pass. And I'm going to present two core scenarios to you in this video. The first of them we'll call the Barau Scenario, and the second we'll call Cold War 2.0. Let's start with the Barau Scenario, named for André Barau, the late French mundane astrologer who heavily influenced my own approach to world astrology. In our series on the astrology of the 2020s, S.J. Anderson and I covered Barau's work, and in particular his successful prediction of the 2020 pandemic. You can learn more about that in this video. Barau thought that the pandemic of 2020 would initiate several years of crisis that would engulf the world. But he thought that by 2026, the crisis would be over. One of the reasons he said this is because of this configuration in 2026, when the three outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, will be in the aspect pattern known as a minor grand trine. This is a flowing and harmonious relationship between these three signifiers of great change. And if we add the greater benefic Jupiter to the party in July 2026, then we get the configuration that SJ has called the basket. Here's what Barau said about this astrology. It is the most benefic configuration of the century, and its interplanetary partnership will work for the best in a splendid relaunch of civilization. It contains a harmonious relationship between primordial polar opposites, the coming together of the external and the internal, rational and spiritual, mind and soul, human beings surpassing themselves while experiencing life on a higher level. He also said this period of crisis of 2020 is resolved in 2026, when Uranus becomes sextile to Saturn, Neptune in Aries, and trine Pluto in Aquarius. We will then have 9 ascending cycles and the most beautiful configuration of the 21st century. So Barau had a very positive vision of 2026, and Barau was a legendary astrologer who spent his entire life studying history and these cycles. And he's not the only experienced astrologer predicting similar things. So I respect that perspective and seriously consider the possibility that Barau and these other practitioners could turn out to be right. And I hope they are. But that then prompts the question, what would the resolution of this crisis look like? What would need to happen between now and 2026 to lead to a splendid relaunch of civilization, as Barau puts it? Well, this would mean that the current geopolitical crisis would need to burn itself out in the next 2 years. And honestly, I find it difficult to imagine how that could happen. in such a short period of time. But I suppose there are possibilities. As we've seen, I flagged in this series the growing threat of nuclear weapons. We could enter something resembling the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which we come to the brink of nuclear confrontation once again. And then, as in 1962, the great powers of the world could realize that everybody would lose in a nuclear war and decide they had no choice but to come to a settlement. Or perhaps in a series of bold and quick maneuvers, one side defeats the other so comprehensively that it gets to dictate the terms of the new world and the other is forced to accept it. But I'm pretty skeptical that something like that could happen and everything would feel splendid by 2026. So I think that for the Barau scenario to play out, we might require some kind of deus ex machina, a surprising factor that changes the whole situation quickly and dramatically, one that completely resets the rules of the game. But what could that deus ex machina be? Well, there are some candidates that we've looked at in this series. Perhaps AI soon reaches a state of superintelligence and becomes able to furnish us with the kind of infinite abundance that its proponents claim is soon coming. Again, I'm skeptical that we're going to reach that heaven on earth, but who knows? But if it were to happen, there would no longer be any need for us to fight over limited resources, since there'd be more than enough to go round and to uplift the whole planet. And of course, on the surface of things, this sounds great. Or another way to describe it might be Ahriman to the rescue. Or what if we see a natural disaster or celestial event of such magnitude that it snaps us out of our complacency and makes our differences suddenly seem petty and irrelevant? The weather is getting increasingly freaky these days, and who knows what nature has in store for us? Or perhaps the UFO phenomenon stages some kind of intervention. As you'll no doubt have realized following this series, I think the UFO phenomenon is a far more important part of our story than most people assume. That said, we don't know what it is or where it's coming from.
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west.
I think there's a good chance it's not in fact extraterrestrial at all, and it is in fact the manifestation of forces that have been with us on this planet for a very long time, and which have been spoken of in folklore and spiritual traditions for millennia. And we may well be looking at UFO phenomena, plural. We may be seeing manifestations of multiple forces that wish to push us in different directions. And just as humans have very different agendas, so might these beings. And there's also an element of human manipulation at play when it comes to this issue. And there's very good reason to think that intelligence agencies and other influential figures are pushing an understanding of this phenomenon that aligns with their goals, whatever they may currently be. That said, I do believe that the phenomenon is, in an important sense, real. There are too many well-documented, unexplained cases to dismiss it, in my opinion. I know plenty of people who've seen these things with their own eyes. Pluto-Neptune cycles have to do with the evolution of faith, consciousness, and our fundamental beliefs. And this current one that began in the late 19th century will be no different. And along with scholars of religion like Diana Pasulka and Jeffrey Kripal, I think that we're seeing a new faith emerging, one that's being shaped both by the UFO phenomenon itself and by certain parties who are interested in influencing our deepest fundamental beliefs. And when I think about what might happen in the coming years, one of the events I keep coming back to is something we looked at earlier in this series, and it happened as the First World War was raging. This event was the culmination of a series of strange happenings that took place in Portugal in 1917. That year, an apparition of what is believed by many to have been the Virgin Mary appeared to 3 children in Fatima, Portugal, several times over the course of many months. She asked them to pray for peace in the world, and she gave them 3 prophecies of the future, and she eventually told them that she would perform a public miracle to ensure that the world believed the children were telling the truth about what they'd seen. On October the 13th, 1917, an audience, perhaps as large as 100,000, gathered at a place specified by the apparition and then witnessed what sounds very much like a UFO sighting, in which the sun was seen to dance in the sky. This is what has gone down in history as the miracle of the sun. Now, at this time, Pluto and Neptune were in a semi-sextile aspect, But this was also the year of a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. We could read a Saturn-Neptune conjunction as signifying the manifestation of spirit. In the coming years, I think we can expect to see more and more strange things in the sky and the growing in prominence in public consciousness of the UFO phenomenon. Could we even see something akin to the miracle of Fatima in 2026, when there will be a conjunction of Saturn and Neptune, just as there was in 1917? Well, funnily enough, there are suggestions in the UFO community that something of that kind may indeed be on the way. Those of you who are familiar with UFO lore may be aware of this man, Chris Bledsoe. In 2007, Bledsoe supposedly began to encounter glowing orb-shaped UFOs on his property in North Carolina. And in 2012, he claims he had an encounter with a luminous being he calls the Lady, who looked like this. She supposedly gave Bledsoe the power to heal people and told him certain prophecies about the future. And this is of course reminiscent of the miracle of Fatima. And here's where this gets really interesting. The Lady gave Chris Bledsoe the following prophecy: when the red star of Regulus appears on the horizon just before dawn in the gaze of the Sphinx, a new knowledge shall come into the world. Bledsoe has repeated these exact words many times. And he's also stated the year when he thinks it's going to happen, and it's 2026. Although the Lady herself didn't specify that year, Chris has said in interviews that he thinks the prophecy will come to pass in 2026 at the spring equinox of that year. This is very strange because Regulus appears before dawn in the gaze of the Sphinx every year. The Sphinx faces east, the point from which the sun, the planets, and the stars of the zodiac rise. And so the prophecy seems to refer to what astrologers call the heliacal rising of Regulus, which is the moment when it first emerges from the beams of the sun and becomes visible in the morning sky. But what's puzzling about Bledsoe's interpretation of the prophecy is that this actually happens in September each year, not in the spring. And it's not clear why the year 2026 has been singled out, since this happens every year. That said, Bledsoe has admitted he doesn't have the astronomical knowledge to check this himself. He's said that he's been given this information by other people around him. We're now going to watch a clip from Bledsoe Said So, the podcast run by Chris Bledsoe's son, Ryan.
They're not going to stop the awakening. That's the new knowledge that I was told about, and I didn't know when the date would be, and I still don't. I just know that the alignment she gave me is in the spring equinox, Easter of 2026.
That's crazy because some of the people in NASA told us it was the fall equinox.
I misinterpreted it. I thought they originally told me that it was the fall, but I was totally corrected here about a year ago that it was the spring equinox.
And something to bear in mind here is that Chris has had a lot of contact with military and intelligence people who are apparently interested in his case and the abilities he supposedly gained from his encounters. So this is all very strange, but worth keeping in mind as we approach 2026. But there's more. Another well-known figure in UFO circles is this guy, John Ramirez, a self-confessed former CIA agent. Ramirez has become well known in UFO circles. He claims to be an experiencer himself, and he's said that he thinks something big is coming in 2027.
We're kind of preparing the US population, at least, and by extension, the world population, into that reality that there is a presence here, and that we need to explain this presence. Because if they show up and we continue to do what we did before, previous decades, and they show up, there will be mass panic. But I think the word got out within the government that they're showing up in 2027, and we better be prepared, and if not, there's going to be a lot of explaining to do.
In this series, we've seen how the conjunctions of 1891 and 1892 took place at 8 Gemini, making that a hot degree when it comes to the phenomenon and the other themes of this series. In 2027 and 2028, Uranus, the planet of shock, surprise, technology, and revolution, will be transiting across that very degree. So it seems that we're being fed the idea that big things might happen in 2026 or 2027 by people connected with intelligence agencies. And I suppose it's possible that they do actually know something is coming, and that the current and ongoing disclosure process that we've been seeing since 2017 is aimed at preparing us for that.
So I think I would say that people in the government are aware of something happening, and that there's limited time, a few more years to prepare the people, and that's what's ramping up this acceleration from the previous 7 decades of not even acknowledging it to now we are acknowledging it at a faster and faster pace.
But another possibility is that some kind of operation is underway aimed at convincing people that non-human intelligences are indeed present on this planet and that something big is coming in the future related to them. I'll leave you to think about why that might be the case, if indeed it is. Some people will be screaming the words Operation Bluebeam at the screen now. I personally find the details of that conspiracy theory pretty ridiculous, but who really knows? Stranger things may have happened. Of course, the funny thing about our current moment is that if something like Fatima happened today and people recorded it on their phones, most of us would probably just assume the footage was just faked by AI. A lot of us would need to see things with our own eyes to believe. And even then, who knows what human technology can do these days. Regardless of whether the crisis ends in 2026, as Barau predicted, I think public consciousness of the UFO phenomenon is going to rise to a new crescendo in the coming years. But let's now consider the other scenario, Cold War 2.0. In this series, we've seen how we're moving towards the final period of the long Pluto-Neptune sextile. This is due to Pluto's eccentric orbit, which means that it speeds up and moves at roughly the same speed through the zodiac as Neptune for about a century. But there are actually 2 times during the 500-year Pluto-Neptune cycle when this happens. The first is during the waxing sextile of the cycle, and the second is during the waning trine, when the 2 planets are in the second of their 120-degree aspects with each other. In the current cycle, this is going to happen in the late 22nd and 23rd centuries. But the last time Pluto and Neptune did this during their last 500-year cycle was during the 18th century. Here's an archetypal explorer chart for that waning trine. And yes, it looks very similar to the chart for the waxing sextile that we've been examining. Pluto and Neptune perfected the aspect every year from 1704 until 1741, and the planets separated for a good 30-year period during the middle of the 1700s, and then they returned for a final period of exact trines at the end of the century. Now, we won't go into a deep analysis of the history of this period, don't worry, but what we will do is note this final period of exact trines here between the years of 1776 and 1786. And you'll almost certainly know that this was a rather incredible period in history. The American Declaration of Independence came in 1776 during the first year of those exact trines, and just before that, the Revolutionary War had broken out. And in 1789, as the 2 planets were separating, came the French Revolution and the founding of the American government. And these titanic changes came only after this final set of exact Pluto-Neptune trines. This is another reason why I suspect that we may be at the beginning of a process of reorganization of the world right now, rather than looking at something that's going to be over within a couple of years. The other interesting thing to note is that Pluto is in Aquarius both at the end of the long waning trine and the long waxing sextile. So it was in Aquarius during those Enlightenment revolutions, and it's there right now. But there are other factors that point to a longer crisis. Firstly, Uranus is about to move into the sign of Gemini. As we discussed in this video, every time Uranus has been in Gemini, the US has engaged in an armed conflict that ended up reshaping its institutions. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and the Second World War. Uranus enters Gemini for the first time in July 2025 and won't leave for the final time this cycle until 2033. We also have Saturn and Neptune about to transition into the sign of Aries in 2025. Aries is the sign ruled by Mars, the planet of conflict. The last time Neptune moved into Aries was April the 13th, 1861, the day after the US Civil War started. Saturn won't leave Aries for the last time until April 2028, and Neptune, the planet that signifies the orientation of our collective imagination, won't leave that sign until 2039. Now, to be frank, those Aries transits don't scream peace to me. I'm also mindful that the current crisis could be said to have begun with the COVID-19 pandemic, which began at the time of a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in January 2020. So the current Saturn-Pluto cycle is also relevant here. Judging by the themes that the pandemic brought forth, I think this cycle will have to do with the implementation of global technocratic mechanisms, competition between the US and China, and potentially even biowarfare. And the full fruition of that cycle, the Saturn-Pluto opposition, won't come until 2035 and 2036. And finally, the United Nations was founded on the 24th of October, 1945. Here's the chart, and you can see that Uranus had reached 17 degrees of Gemini by that time. Uranus will return to that position in 2029 and 2030. That would be a time when we could really expect a dramatic shakeup in the international governance system. All this suggests the possibility to me that we could be looking at a long global crisis that lasts at least until 2030 and possibly until the middle of that decade. But there's also another possibility. What if both the Barau and the Cold War 2.0 scenarios turn out to be right at the same time? In the early 60s, we came very close to global nuclear war. They were, in many ways, deeply troubled times, and yet many people also remember them fondly as times of liberation, creativity. It may be that Barau will be right in the sense that the shape of a new world civilization will begin to emerge in 2026. Perhaps an alternative to the current model, which, let's face it, has been dominated to the benefit of the West, will crystallize and begin to gain strength. But there could be a period of potentially violent negotiation between the backers of the status quo and those who want to see changes to the balance of power. And so we may also see that second Cold War. It could be that, as in the early 60s and the early 1980s, we have to live under great threat to our lives. Yet we may also see this time as a kind of technologically driven renaissance. Much of this depends on how we choose to use the technology that's emerging at the current time. Will it be used for liberation or to create new forms of enslavement? We need to remain alert to the opportunities and perils of the current moment. As I've said before, we're in danger of falling prey to deepening attachment to materialism by merging ourselves ever more closely with information technology. This is Ahriman's trap, and we need to remain wary of falling into that too. The financial system is and will continue to be a key theatre in this conflict. And I think the system that emerges will almost certainly involve the use of digital currency to facilitate global trade. The question, of course, is which digital currency? What I'm sure of is that in the coming years, we're going to see all the themes of this series coming together. The emergence of a new faith, UFOs, nuclear weapons, reform to the system of global governance, and the perils and promise of information technology. If there's one message from this series, it's that we're living through a mercurial age. Mercury is the planet of duality, and in astrology, the planet is seen as neither benefic nor malefic. What this tells me about our age is that besides the theme of reconciling spirit and science, it's one of unprecedented freedom. As a species, our training wheels have been taken off. We're increasingly free of the dogmas of the past, and we're being called to take responsibility for the world and our lives in newfound freedom. That may also involve choosing to return to principles that were formerly imposed on us, or it may involve permanently throwing them out. And in this moment of peril and promise, the stakes are as high as they can be. As a species, technology has given us immense power that can be used for good or ill. We see the threat of nuclear war returning. AI may also pose a threat to our safety and freedom. And there's the changing climate. All these factors have implications on the need for global coordination. Yet we also need to bear in mind that vested interests could use these threats opportunistically to lead us into the kind of technological control system, the panopticon, that I've been warning about in this series. It's almost as if the stakes have been raised as high as they can be, because that's exactly what's necessary to force us to change profoundly for the better. And so in this crucible of great pressure, under the shadow of death, we're being asked to grow up. These are heavy topics, of course, and I hope you aren't filled with too much foreboding. Despite all that I've said, I'm actually optimistic about the future. We're going to pass through some difficult times in the coming years, but I also see a process of awakening underway. One final message: the very fact that astrology works as well as it does suggests to me that there is purpose and meaning behind the unfolding of history. In other words, the divine is at work. And whatever we go through in the coming years, I believe we are all ultimately loved. What we have to do is find that love within ourselves and direct it steadfastly towards the world and the people around us. Thanks for following me through this series. I know it's been a long ride, but I hope it's given you much to think about. And I hope to see you again very soon.